AutoHotkey, mouse and keyboard remapping, macros, and hotkeys. Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. Question I got years ago actually is how do I create a hotkey for entering my email address? I do this dozens of times a day and it seems to be a chore. So to be clear, there are lots of programs that will do what you're asking. I'm going to share what I use. And I use it not just for email addresses or even email signatures, but for a bunch of other things. In fact, as I updated the article that goes with this video, I used it multiple times. AutoHotkey is a free program that runs in your notification area. It intercepts keystrokes and mouse activity if you like, and allows you to configure anything from simple remapping of one key to another, to simple text insertion, and complex actions that are nearly little programs in and of themselves. The only caveat is that, yes, it's a tad geeky to set up, so it might not be for everyone, but it's incredibly powerful. What I want to do here is show you some of the things that I configure AutoHotkey to do. After installing AutoHotkey, you'll want to set it to run constantly. The best approach I found is this: write your AutoHotkey scripts and configuration in a text file, say my.autohotkey.ahk, and then place a link to that file in the shell startup folder. I'll show you what I mean. Here we have a folder. I happen to keep my AutoHotkey script in Dropbox so that it shows up on all of my machines. You can see there it's AutoHotkey.leo.ahk, very intuitive name. What I'm going to do is run shell :startup, and I'll move this to the side so that we can see there's nothing in the startup folder yet. I'm going to click and drag the AHK file here. Now I'm not releasing. You'll notice it says copy to startup. That's not what I want. Control-Shift says create a link in startup. We'll release that, and now I have AutoHotkey.ahk shortcut in my startup folder. What that means is that every time I sign into this machine, that file, the .ahk file, is going to get run. What that means, of course, is that AutoHotkey will get run. So I'm going to close the shell startup folder and just double click on my AutoHotkey.ahk. And you'll see not much happened except the H icon showed up in the notification area. That means it's running, ready to do its job. I have some examples. What I'm going to do is fire up Notepad and give you, for example, my first simple text insertion. One of the things that I respond to questions with a lot is a link to my article on how to create a screenshot. It's a very useful thing, and I'll often respond to people who are asking me a question, could you give me a screenshot about that? However, not everybody knows how. So, the URL. If I type in one of my responses, close bracket TS, it automatically replaces that with the string, the URL to my article on screenshots. Saves me a bunch of keystrokes every time I do that. What does that look like in my AHK file? I'm glad you asked. Let's open the AHK file, also in Notepad. And then in there, I have a bunch of stuff in here. You can see it's actually quite long. I use AutoHotkey extensively. If in that file, I search for TS, it'll happen a couple of times, but there it is. This is the line. The two lines that are in front of it are simply comments. Anything that begins with a semicolon is a comment, and I use that quite a bit. What this is showing us is whenever you see bracket TS, replace it with this URL. Specifically, the colon character is a delimiter between the fields. The first field with an asterisk in it is an options field. Asterisk simply means to trigger immediately as soon as that last character of the trigger string has been typed. The second field with the bracket TS is the trigger string. I happen to use close bracket as a very common start for my string replacements, but the trigger string can be anything you like. Double colon separates the trigger from its replacement, and then that's followed by the replacement string to be typed in place of the trigger string. There's other stuff we can do. For example, I'm going to get rid of all this, and this time I'm going to type close bracket TD. For me, that's today's date. If I type close bracket TF, that's today's date with the time. What does that look like in AutoHotkey? Well, TD, just up above here, is this. Now, it's showing us the beginnings of multi-line programming. This happens to be a single line, but because I'm using functions, I've decided to treat it as if it were a multi-line program. So that's what the curly braces are. That's why there's nothing after the double colon. That means what follows is what should happen. And then the curly braces basically delimit the small program that's running. Paste text is a function that I've written that uses the Control-V keystroke to paste. It has proven more robust across a wider range of programs. However, you can see format time. Yes, that's an AutoHotkey function, and it lets you create a string to the format you desire for the date, or as you can see on a line below, the date and time, or whatever you would like to do. Email signatures. I wear a bunch of different hats, which means I have many different email signatures. My default, I enter with close bracket GG. That gives me a multi-line response, my name, URL, that kind of stuff. In this case, the AutoHotkey for that is a little different. I will search for GG, and you'll see that it's right here. In this case, once again, I'm using my paste text function, but I'm using something called file read. I actually have that signature stored in a .txt file. Makes it really easy for me to update it whenever I want to update it. So in this case, what AutoHotkey is doing is whenever it sees close bracket GG, it goes out and reads this specific file and then pastes the contents of that file into the current position. My actual signature text isn't in the AutoHotkey script at all. Somewhere along the way, I realized that there are a large number of standard or stock responses that I use regularly. They're bigger, really, than I'd want to put into my AutoHotkey script. But as we've just seen, AutoHotkey can read files. Even better, AutoHotkey can ask what file to use. So if I type close bracket TT, I get a file open dialog box. And that file open dialog box has defaulted to the folder in which I have a bunch of different templates. For example, anytime somebody asks me about their Google password, I've got a response ready to go. Boom, there it is. You can see it's fairly large. It's not something that I necessarily want to clutter up my AutoHotkey script with, but it allows me to have that ready in a keystroke or two. And again, because it's a text file, if I ever make a change to it, which happens from time to time, all I really need to do is update that text file and everything has been updated for me. What does that one look like in AutoHotkey? I'm just going to scroll down to where it is. And there's the multi-line function that is this command. It's the file select function that is at play here. This is the function in AutoHotkey that will open up an open dialog and allow you to choose what file to then work. It then reads the contents of that file into a variable, in my case, SZ file. I double check to see if there's anything in it and throw a warning with the message box function if there's nothing in that file. Otherwise, I paste the text of what I got from that file. File select is where this starts, and what it does is it returns the file name that the user has selected in a file open dialog box. If there's nothing that's been selected, I throw up a message box that says, hey, you didn't pick a file. Otherwise, I then have AutoHotkey read the contents of that file and paste it to wherever my cursor happens to be. Now, I want to clarify, I mentioned it earlier that I'm using close bracket. My format that I've chosen is basically close bracket, letter, letter. And in fact, I use that first letter to kind of categorize the kind of things that I'm asking AutoHotkey to do. I want to be very clear. That's completely arbitrary. I chose that. For me, it's rare that I type a string starting with a close bracket, meaning it's a great candidate to dedicate to string replacement shortcuts, like I've shown you so far. In reality, your trigger string can be anything you want. BTW could automatically be replaced with, by the way. Or Leo at A could be immediately replaced by Leo at askleo.com for a quick shortcut to avoid having to type the entire email address every time, again, if that's something you do frequently. I do have some more ideas here, originally from the AutoHotkey homepage. You can automate almost anything by sending keystrokes and mouse clicks. You can write a mouse or keyboard macro by hand, or there's actually a built-in macro recorder. You can create hotkeys for keyboard, joystick, and mouse. Virtually any key, button, or combination can become a hotkey. Expanding abbreviations as you type them is one of the very common ways of doing this. Like I said, BTW being replaced by the string by the way. That seems like a small, trivial example, but it's very possible that you have longer strings that you're constantly typing that could easily be replaced in this way with something shorter. And you can even create custom data entry forms, user interfaces, menu bars. Again, the GUI interface has the details. And finally, you can remap keys and buttons on your keyboard, your joystick, and mouse. Just because I replaced a key sequence with a string doesn't mean you can't have a single key be replaced by a single key. The approach that I'm using, hand coding the AutoHotkey macros, can seem a tad geeky, because it is, but it's incredibly powerful. My simple examples really only skim the surface of what AutoHotkey can be used for. For simple things like text replacement or keystroke remapping, it's a near-perfect solution. AutoHotkey, I recommend it. For updates, for comments, for links related to this topic and more, visit askleo.com/3668. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.